I'm just going to welcome you on behalf of the Wolf Institute, which is responsible for organizing this week, along with a lot of faculty input. I'm the interim director. I'm Professor Chris Ebert, also in the history department. And I want to also remind you, you have a program with all of the biographical data, but I think you all know Ms. Danticat and her work because you've been reading it in your class. You're all welcome to attend the keynote event tomorrow evening at Tanger at 5:05. So that's for all of you as well too. So if you're free, please do come and also join us in the reception afterwards, which will be just one flight above us. We have actually an excellent caterer who's also a friend of our guest for this week, who's going to be putting on quite a spread. So. With that, I will turn it over, and thanks for coming.
So I just want to, I think most of the students that I see here are students from my class, but I'll just give a very brief introduction to what we've been doing this semester and what the class is about, so that those of you who aren't part of the class can have a sense of what we've been doing this semester. This class is called Digital Life Stories, Chican, Latina Testimonio. So it's a course that's cross-listed with Women and Gender Studies. It's a course in the Puerto Rican and Latino Studies Department, and it's also cross-listed with American Studies. And so we spend much of the semester reading testimonios or life stories, and thinking about personal experience and life stories as the basis for, or how does it enable us to think about structures of power, think about the world around us when we center our own stories, our life stories, that so often are not told or don't get into kind of mainstream media. So the idea of the importance of centering our own lives as points of reflection, as a place of theory making. And so the course is based off of Cherie Moraga's idea of theorizing from the flesh. And so we think about the way that our bodies and our stories map the social history of a people and that sort of thing. So this semester we read Brother, I'm Dying by Danticat, and it's such a pleasure to be able to have the author here. She's going to read, it's the same setup we've done with other guest speakers. She's going to read a little bit from the text, and then I have 2 or 3 questions. So you and I will sit here for a couple of minutes and just have a dialogue, and then open it up to the audience for the students to ask questions, because they have lots of questions as well. And then I think she's also said she's willing to sign books afterwards. So thank you so much for being here.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to Professor Perez Rosario for having me. So I'm looking forward to our conversation, but as she said, I'm going to just read a little bit from the book. And for those of you who may not have read it, Brother, I'm Dying is a memoir. I started writing it in 2004, right after both my father and my uncle died. My father was diagnosed with pulmonary fibrosis and at the end stage at the same time that I was pregnant with my first daughter, and then my uncle had died in immigration custody around that same time. So those 3 things were happening, and my uncle was my Uncle Joseph, who raised me in Haiti while my parents were here working in Brooklyn. So I thought I would read, there's 2 parts since this is about listening to Caribbean women's stories. The first part that I'll read has to do about the birth of my daughter, which was like the part of the life cycle of in the middle of this moment. And And often, I think, in the political realm, our personal narratives get lost in ways that immigration affects families. So here I was in the middle of this, both my tie to Brooklyn and to America, really my father who brought me to America dying, and my uncle who was the brother in the family who had always refused to come to America because he always thought like there should be somebody who stays behind to welcome the returnees home. And the two of them, because of this twist of fate, end up buried together in Queens in Cypress Hill Cemetery, because when my uncle died in immigration custody, we couldn't return to bury him in Haiti as he had wanted to. So this part is called Transition. It's about my daughter's birth. It's sort of the more personal part of it. And then the second part I'll read is also personal, but it will sort of tie to a kind of mythology about the dead that I was told when I was young, and that became very comforting to me when both my uncle and my father died. So this is Transition. There is a stage in labor called transition, when the baby, preparing to separate from the mother, twists and turns to pass through the birth canal. I am sure that there's a similar stage for exiting life, though it might be less definitive. Still, as I go into labor with my daughter, I wish for an easy transition for her and myself, and I wish the same for my father. Our midwife, Colleen, encouraged me to add some personal touches to the lavender labor room at the birthing center, so I'd brought 2 old photos of my mother and father. In his picture, my father is a handsome, serious-looking 26-year-old. He's wearing a pale jacket, a high-collared shirt, a pencil-thin tie, and tortoiseshell glasses. My mother in hers is wearing a check blouse with a giant button on the front. Her hair is straightened and her round face framed by small, star-shaped drop earrings. When the midwife sees my mother's picture, she thinks that my mother is me. I look at my parents' sepia-toned faces intermittently during the 16 hours that I walked, lay down, sat in a tub, on a ball, on the toilet, in constant agony. How could my mother have done this 4 times, I wondered. My mother once briefly told me the story of my birth. I was nearly born in a pebbled courtyard outside the maternity ward of Port-au-Prince's General Hospital. My father was out of the city for his work, and my mother, fiercely independent, proud and alone, was one of a nearly dozen women who were doubled over, wailing in the yard. There were too many of them and not enough doctors. No one even examined them until their babies crowned. During her 4 hours of active labor, my mother tried very hard not to wish death upon herself. She staggered in and out of consciousness until a doctor finally surfaced and rushed her to the delivery room. When my daughter was born, her face blood-tinted, her eyelids swollen with tiny light pinch patches that the midwife called angel kisses, her body coiled around itself as if to echo the tinyness of her tiny fist, I instantly saw it as many separations to come. She was leaving my body and going into the world where she would spend the rest of her life moving away from me. Groggy and exhausted, I asked the midwife, "Is it normal for me to think like this? Maybe you're one of those women who enjoys being pregnant forever," she said. It wasn't so much that I enjoyed being pregnant, I told her. I simply liked the fact that for a while, my daughter and I had been inseparable. Looking at her tiny face, her bow-shaped lips, so that her father said she looked like she was wearing lipstick, I remembered a message a girlfriend had sent me when my first niece and nephew were born. "May you be a reposoir," she had written, "a place where children can rest." I needed to rest myself, but I also wanted to speak to my daughter, cradle her, sing to her, inhale her mixed blood and soap smell, watch her ever so slightly open her eyes and tighten her mouth as she tried to make sense of all the new sounds around her, my husband's laughter, my mother-in-law's comparisons with relatives both living and gone. I thought my daughter most resembled my mother and pointed at the picture to prove it, but I also saw traces of my father, who my mother says was too frightened to hold me and my brothers when we were babies, but who would later hold my brother's children, laugh and sing to them. I grieved for my uncle who would never hold my daughter, and for my Haitian cousins who might never know her, or maybe she would return one day to Léogane or to Bel Air to declare in heavily accented words that they were her family. She might be honored by their nods of acknowledgement, the way they would be forced to agree. Of course, I see the resemblance. You do look like your grandmother around the cheeks. You do have the high forehead of your grandfather's kin. And hopefully those cheeks and that calabash-shaped forehead would gain her entry. Looking into my daughter's eyes, I thought of my mother, who had faced these first hours alone after I was born. She had been made no promises, had been offered no guarantees that either she or I would live past the night. If something had been ruptured inside of her, no one might have noticed. If something had been broken inside of me, no one might have cared. My daughter's quiet yet well-monitored first night was perhaps the one my mother had dreamed for both me and herself, a dream of kind words, kisses, flowers. "What have you decided to call her?" the midwife asked. My husband and I had discussed it. There seemed to be no other possible choice. "Mira," I said, for my dying father. After patiently waiting his turn to hold her, my husband held out his hand. I was also reluctant to let this Mira go. Hopefully I would have an uninterrupted lifetime with her, I thought, a lifetime to plant some things that have been uprooted in me and uproot others that had been planted. But surrender her I did, with an urgent wish to also hand her over to my dying father. "Gade, Papa, look, Papa," I would say, "you have waited for her. You have lived long enough to see her. Today is not just her day, but all of our days. And we are not the only ones who will cradle and protect her. She too will also hold and comfort us. She will be our reposoir, our sacred place to rest." This next bit is about storytelling. It's a story I was told when I was very little. Then I was told a lot of stories when I was little, just like because it's part of our tradition. And I often didn't understand why I was told certain stories. And this particular story, when I was writing this book, and I wrote it when my daughter was a newborn, and both my uncle and my father, who were both like my two fathers, had just died. So I was grieving while I wrote it, and there were so many stories that I was told, I realized why I was told them, and this is one of them, about a daughter and her father who had died. Grand-mère Melina once told a story about a daughter whose father had died. The daughter loved her father so much that her heart was shattered into 100 pieces. When it came time to plan for the jubilant country wake, which was once held the night before all funerals, the daughter wanted no part of it and ordered that it not be held. "Tifi, daughter," said one of the wise old women in the daughter's village, "please let the people rejoice at your father's wake tonight before they cry at his funeral tomorrow." "There will be no rejoicing," answered the daughter. "Why would I ever rejoice again when my father is dead?" "Tifi, daughter," insisted the old woman, "please let the wake be held. Your father is now in the land beneath the waters. It is not our way to let our grief silence us." Knowing that the old woman had the gift that the ancestors grant to only a chosen few of being able to journey between the living and the dead, the daughter said to the old woman, "I will allow the wake to be held only if you go to the land beneath the waters and bring my father back." The old woman walked to the nearest river and slipped into the waters, and a few hours later she reemerged and walked straight to the daughter's house. "Where's my father?" asked the daughter. "Tifi," said the old woman, "daughter, I am back from beneath the waters, deep into the bowels of the earth. There were some wide and narrow roads. I took them. There were many hills and mountains, and I climbed them. There were hamlets and villages, towns and cities, and I passed through them too. And finally I reached the land of the ancestors, the city of the dead. Did you see my father? Asked the daughter impatiently. I saw so many people there I couldn't even tell you, answered the old woman. I saw my mother and father, my uncle and grandmother, my aunt and my sister who died in childhood. All my loved ones who died were there. But did you see my father? Shouted the daughter. Tifi, answered the old woman. I looked and I looked amongst all those people until I did find your father. Where is he? Asked the daughter. I have come to take you back to the land of the living, I told your father. Your daughter's heart is broken into 100 pieces, and she says she cannot live without you. What did he say to that? Asked the daughter. I am so touched that my daughter wants me to come back, your father said. But my home is now here, in the land of the ancestors. Tell my daughter for me that les moun vivant, mais les moun mouri. When one is alive, one is alive, but when one is dead, one is dead. The old woman then pulled from her pocket a set of false teeth that the father had religiously worn in his mouth when he was still among the living and had taken with him into the land of the dead. Your father sent you this, said the old woman, so that you might believe that I saw him and accept what he says. The daughter took the false teeth in her hands and looked at them with great sadness, but also with a new sense of courage. As my father wishes, so it shall be, she said. We will have the wake to honor him, to rejoice and celebrate his life before his body is put in the ground. We will eat, we will sing, we will dance, and we will continue to tell our stories. But most importantly, we will speak of our loved ones, and we will speak of my father, for it is not our way to let our grief silence us. Thank you.
Thank you. That was beautiful. So moving. It's such a moving book.
Share this.
Okay, thanks. So I have just a few questions, maybe to get this conversation going, and then I know the students have several questions as well. But I wondered if, just to tie this to the theme of the class, if you could talk a little bit about the importance of centering your stories, or how that, I know this is memoir, you write fiction as well, you write essays in a lot of your work. It seems you do draw from personal experience, so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that process of writing, and where your personal story, how your personal stories fit into your work.
We'll take it off and pass it.
Okay.
I really like the idea of centering, as you put it. And even though this book is a memoir, I always think of it, a couple of years ago it was chosen as the first year reads here. Yes, at Brooklyn College. And I remember in that talk saying that I always think of it like a memoir is like a memoir, like the me. And I always think of it as a we-moir. It's more the story of a collective than the story of one person. It's the one book I feel like if I just had written one book, I would want it to be this book, because it tells the story of my family, and it centers them for the people in my family. And when I was writing it, people say that, sometimes ideologically, like I'm writing this for myself or I'm writing it for my children. And in this case, it was really, truly the case, because the two people in my life who had told me so many stories, my mother was a very reluctant sort of sharer of her stories, but my father and my uncle were very indulgent with sharing stories with me. And so these were like the two people who were my source of family stories, and they were both gone, and I really felt like this urgency to put it down. And it's the same feeling of like the testimonio that will probably show up in a lot of the stuff you'll read in the class. I really felt like that, the urgency of having, of testimony, and not even so much bearing witness, because that would preclude, like that would include this framing of others, but I just really wanted to put these things down. And I think the centering comes from that, of like just really wanting to, before I would forget, to have them written down for my children, for my nieces and for my nephew, who would have that experience, perhaps that some of you, as the children of immigrants, might have, where you go to your parents' birthplace and then you say your last name, and you have either the shock of somebody saying, "Oh, I knew your family," and it's a delight when it works, but when it doesn't, you feel just kind of stranded out there, And so that was the idea. That was why I wanted to even write the book in the first place.
Yeah, and that's one of the things, as a testimonio, this text as a testimonio, I think, because you center your story, but you don't only center your story. It's an interesting, I think, memoir, because you're telling the story of your father and of your uncle, so it's not the same kind of first-person narrative that you get in so many memoirs, I think, which is one of the things that's beautiful about it. Another question, I guess, the literary scholar Carol Boyce Davies, who I'm sure you're familiar with, has written that literature and the affective responses speak in ways that numbers cannot. And so you've been writing a lot about immigration. And so I think about the role of literature and the arts in terms of thinking about immigration. And so a couple of years ago, there was a recording of you reading Felix Morisot's poem, Boat People, which I love that poem. And I've been thinking a lot about boat people in various works of Caribbean literature. And those two things, I'm reminded of what Carol Boyce Davies has said, that literature speaks in ways that numbers cannot. And so often we don't really even have numbers of boat people. So I wondered about the enormous challenge of writing about people whose stories, and so much of this literature often tell the story of them not surviving the journey. So you're writing stories about other people's suffering. You're writing stories about people who we don't even know who they are a lot of the time. I think of your story, Children of the Sea, and so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, about writing those kinds of stories.
Well, I think one of the reasons that I'm drawn to write certain kind of stories is like a lacune, like because there's a gap, or there's something that feels to me to have been skipped. So with the Felix Morisot poem, for example, it ends with him saying, the poem ends with something like, rather than boat people, how about calling us people?
Yeah.
Right? And it's it's obvious, but it's such a powerful statement. And and then he makes this connections, like, was Columbus a boat person, right? He came by boat and took everything and killed everybody. So the framing of that, and which was, and Mano Charlemagne, who's the Haitian singer, who also, when he talks about alien cards, green cards, he's like, well, did we demand a green card of Columbus? And sort of, you see a recurring theme there in terms of boats. And so I've always wanted to know about that journey and so many of our people have made the journey. Of course, it has echoes to the Middle Passage, and then when I was in graduate school, a group of people came to Providence, and they were resettled by Catholic Charities there, and people in the community came to the school and asked us to to help to volunteer with some of the families. And then the family I was with, the father died during the passage, and it was a mom and her kids, and they would talk about the journey, and so a lot of what's in this in Children of the Sea comes from that, from hearing their experiences. And I think it's important for us to know about these journeys, especially, now there's a lot more compassion for both people. I don't say too much, I wouldn't say too much more compassion, but there is, because you have the situation in Europe, right, where people are coming, and then initially there's compassion, and then it's like the volume. So it's also interesting to see in the period we're living in, where, okay, this is not a Haitian issue, this is not a Caribbean issue only, there are other people who are coming to other places by sea, and people have always traveled by sea. People have always migrated to other places for opportunities. And so I think literature does that, like poem does that. It brings in, it ties in all these, and then if you have a singular experience of a singular person or a singular family going to that, it allows us an entry in a way that the statistics, and just now it's images, when they had that little boy's body on the beach. And and that whole week when people were talking about that, I thought, oh, it's great that people's eyes have been open, but does it take like a tiny child who's looking angelic to be dead in the sand to move us? does it have to go that far, for people to be stirred? And so, but there is a power in singularity, right? Whether it's through literature, whether through a poem or through an image, where suddenly people are like, oh yes, I get it, because of this one singular thing that I've been shown or told of,
Thank you. And then maybe just one last question before we open it up. I wonder if keeping on this theme of immigration, because of course that's an important, it's a theme in this book as well, Brother, I'm Dying. To what extent, perhaps, is a new language necessary to kind of shift the public discourse? You talked about this a little bit in the end of your response here, but how do we shift the public discourse on immigration? I know you do it through your writing, but I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit. Yeah.
It's tricky for us to have the burden of changing the discourse, because we know who we are. We know that most of us are not rapists. We know that we're not bad hombres. So we know we're not what we're being told we are. So, and sadly, in the current environment, like the people with power, or the ones scapegoating, right? Who are calling us names, and then the calling of the names, it's not just calling people names, but it's tied to policy, right? So in the case of Haiti, you have the first thing is, all Haitians have AIDS. And then the next thing is the shithole thing. And then TPS is canceled. And then HB1 and HB2 visas are canceled. So the name calling is just not just like random name calling in this current environment. So, the bad hombre comment is tied to a wall, right? And funding for walls and deportations. And so you criminalize people so you can justify separating their families. So it's not, so the naming we're not doing, right? And so I think on our end, we're continue to do what we've always done, most of us, but we just have to advocate loudly, those of us who are less vulnerable. We advocate for the others who may not be able to show themselves. I think that's very important too, but it's such a toxic environment for immigration right now, for immigrants, especially the most vulnerable immigrants, that we're sort of beyond the name shaming, because there's so many negative actions that are being taken. So just today, the ACLU launched this campaign that I'm part of with the actor Jesse Williams, where we read it's a series of videos that actually gives people tools in terms of what do you do if immigration comes to your door. So you can go on their website and see that, and you share it with people, and it's in 9 different languages. So, and even as I was recording, I record the Creole one, and even as I was recording it, I just, you pray that, gosh, let people have the courage to actually follow these suggestions, because I don't know that I would, to say to the immigration officer, I'm not going to open the door, when they might break it down anyway. But the name of the campaign, it says we have rights, right? It's important to people to be reminded that they still have rights. So, we have to be aware of also the vulnerability of others, those of us who can get in front of them. And I think we'll all have to be sanctuaries at some point for other people in the way that this is going.
Great, thank you. I'd like to open it up to the students to ask their questions. Anyone? Lucian?
Yeah. So yesterday I was talking to a professor of mine she's a historian who focuses on sort of Black Power movement and that wave of feminism. And she wants to incorporate Jesmyn Ward's memoir, Memory Read, into her courses, which are sort of traditional history courses. And I see a lot of similarities between that book and Brother and Dying. And I was wondering what sort of courses and how you see your book being taught in different disciplinary settings, and also if that's different from how you see your novels being taught.
Well, initially when the book was published, it did open this avenue in terms of telling stories like this, because so I was I was on 60 Minutes, and then I was invited to testify before Congress. And one of the things that I hoped would be part of, I was hoping the book would be taught to immigration officers. I thought, what would be great if it would be part of their training, and to remind them that, okay, this is an individual in front of you. It's a person. It's a human being. It's not a number. It's not a case. It's an old man. My uncle was 81 years old when they sent him to his death, really, through this whole process where he came, and then, they took his medication, and then he died tied to a bed in the prison ward of a local hospital. And at that point, they were not counting those outside of the detention center deaths as death in immigration. So if someone was near death, they would just shuttle you to the nearest county hospital, and then you are not a death in immigration. So then the numbers just always stayed low. So I felt like I wanted the book to be taught to everybody who has this position that my uncle faced, because each and every one of them, from the immigration officer at the airport to the person at the detention center, they each had the discretionary power to release him, and they didn't do that. And so I didn't want that to happen to other people. And so, in classroom settings, I think a lot of us don't realize, immigration, first, is a very private business. And there's something called a bed mandate, where they have to have a certain number of people in immigration detention every day. And with the enforcement on steroids has a lot to do with that. And it's big business, the immigration detention, it's a very big business. And that's why people die in custody, because if you have cancer, you still get an aspirin, right? And so all of these things factor into it. So in the classroom, in this kind of political science in different settings, I think it's so important for individuals, Americans, to know what's being done in their name. And I think in that part, in that way, it's an individual story, but it's something that I met so many families whose loved ones were in that same situation. And yeah, with like, it's very similar with Jesmyn Moore's Men We Reap. I think it's kind of, it's a witness. She's a witness to that, you know, to these deaths of her brother and her uncle, and it's a living example of this, you know, systematic injustice that leads to that. And I think it's an individual story, it's bearing witness, it's testimonio, and I think those things are important for us to hear, how these policies affect individuals, affect families, because a lot of people frankly don't know. And once you've read or heard one of these stories, it's hard to say that you don't know anymore.
I'm half Dominican, so it kind of like I see on the news a lot that there's kind of, like whenever something happens, because of the mass immigration of Haitians going into the Dominican Republic, I see that there's kind of like the criminalization that's going on here, it's going on over there. So do you think that there's ever going to be like a time where like both countries can finally like make a compromise about what's going on? Because I feel like, I think that immigration, like anywhere, it's a good thing. So I feel like that if there's people going into the country, they could kind of find a way to come together and like actually stimulate one another's like economy, or just like make it livable to be with each other. But that's what it seems like.
Well, just this morning, on the immigration panel we had a very lengthy discussion just about that, about Haiti, Haiti DR migration. It's a very complicated history there, because it's one of the, I think it's possibly like the only place in the world, if not one of a few, where it's one island with two countries. And in many cases, in the Dominican case, certainly, the Dominican Republic defines itself in opposition to Haiti, and saying like, we are everything they're not. And there's the history of 1822, when Haiti was in the Dominican Republic, and on our side, there's the massacre of 1937, and there are all these historical scars, and it seems like there are periods when the intensity of things spike, and we seem to be in a period like that, where there was a recent incident, and on the border, and then all the sort of supranationalists get riled up, and the discourse really gets bloody. And the Dominican Republic, that the immigration there specifically, it seems to be a very, in terms of Haitian, and they'll say Haitian, people will say Haitian, but it's really Dominicans of Haitian descent, people who have been there for generations. There seems to be a very specific policy towards them. I think that's where the inequality is strongest, because that policy that applies to the Haitian migrants or Dominicans of Haitian descent is not the same for like the new Venezuelan migrants who are coming, for example. So I think ultimately, people on the island, it's a long history of good, and there are good moments too, where and it's something that goes back so far through history, but also we have a common history of U.S. occupation, doing like sort of a Jim Crow-like era, where it's like light skin on top and so forth, and all of these things have factored into the relationship that we have today. But there are some very good people on the island who are working together for the rights of not just the migrants, but also the Dominicans of Haitian descent. And I think we have to also always stress, when you talk about Haitian migration into the Dominican Republic, that the majority, a lot of the people we're talking about, are dark Dominicans of Haitian descent who are not being given their papers because they have a name like Pierre, or, there's a story recently of this woman who is an athlete who wants to compete internationally, but she's not giving identity papers because she's of Haitian descent, and stories like that. But it's a relatively small island, so we have to, at some point, hopefully there'll be some kind of balance, so that these moments of of hostilities, you know, won't be as destructive as they've been in the past.
My question is kind of on the terms of sharing your own personal story. And you talk about the burden that is placed upon us, especially as women of color, to change the discourse and to kind of project our personal stories, to recognize the power dynamics and the structures that are outside that reflect in our personal story. Do you ever fear or have anxiety that like your story could become a monolith for all people who closely identify with you, or who identify with some aspects of your story?
Well, that's something that's in the life, I think, of every person of color who writes, or who writes especially, right? It's a risk that you run into. For example, when my book Breath, Eyes, Memory was published, it became very problematic for people. I thought I was writing a novel about a very specific family. After all, the book says novel on the cover, so I assume people would think, okay, it's fiction, but it's also the way we're read by others, right? Like outside of our experience. So people read us often anthropologically. So you'll read this novel and you say, oh, all Haitians do that. Even though it's like it's a novel, it's fiction, it's one family. And so that's the thing that's the risk we all take. And I think that's the risk that's combated with the more of us, the more stories, the better. So that's why in my own sort of career, I've tried to, edit anthologies. I've tried to bring in as many other voices as possible, because I think the more of us, the more we complicate that monolith, right? The more it's like that thing of there can be only one. But for me, I would still take the risk of telling that story, because I think the alternative is silence, right? I would still take all the heat. I would still take all that. Of course, you want to, with nuance and everything, but what's the alternative then is not telling any story, right? Because you can't control the way you're read. You can only control what you say. And you've been very patient. So.
Do you think like writing is a gift you were born with, or is it more of like the things you went through your life, like shaped you and gave you that?
I think writing for me was always a passion. Like even when I didn't know how I wanted to write even before I knew about publishing. And I love stories, and like I said, I was told stories, and I thought I want to do that, but I was a very shy little girl, so I was like, I'm not going to be like a performative storyteller. And then when I got my first book, I was like, yes, this is the way I can do it, like where it's just you and one person. I love that part of it, and I thought, I didn't know how the book went from like being written to how it became hardcover. I didn't know any of that. But when I read, my first book, which was Madeline, that In a House in Paris book, and I thought, oh, I want to do that. And I want to do what this person that I've never met and I will never meet did for me. And I'm reading this book and thinking, oh, this house in Paris is like my house with all my cousins, with no parents, but just this old couple that was looking after a whole bunch of kids whose parents were in different countries working. So that I felt like that powerful sort of identification with something that should be unfamiliar to you, but has this emotional familiarity. So for me, it was just always a passion. And from the moment I realized I could write things, I was always unhappy when I wasn't doing it. So for me, it was just like, and I would do it if nobody, I always told my parents, which then they would dare me. I would say, well, even if my parents really wanted me to be a doctor, and I said, even if I was a doctor, I'd be writing. They're like, prove it,
in that time, like, did it also help you, like, bond more with your daughter while writing the memoir as well?
Yes, absolutely. Writing the book was very therapeutic for me. And it was this time, and I felt like it was the fastest I had ever written a book. And when I look back, I can't even fully understand when I did it, because I had a newborn, and I wasn't sleeping very much, and I wasn't, I had it was a first child, I had the mommy brain, but I had 2 grandmas with me too. So I was both my mother and my mother-in-law were with me, but I really don't have a full, a lot of my books I remember where I was, and I knew I was in my house, but it was written mostly late at night, with like a baby next to me, and I just don't really remember the specifics of it. But what I felt, I always wanted to go back to it, because it felt like visiting with my fathers. I felt like visiting with them, and I felt like as long as I was in the book, I was with them. And so that part was very healing. And people will often say, "Oh, that book is not angry enough," and they'll say they'll say it's not angry, it's sort of even toned, and there was a part of the book of my project of writing the book, I knew I wanted it to be, I didn't want it to be a tract, I didn't want it to be like an anti-immigration pamphlet, right? I wanted it also to be art, like I wanted it to have a similar elements to the novels, like that you were saying, and I wanted to have a kind of aesthetic, but I wanted also to make a case that you read this and you tell me if you were in this position, if you would make the same decision that these people make. And that's why there's a lot of documentation in it. We sued the government to get the records. And the first bunch of records we got was like all black. Like literally, it was like we just got black paper with all the lines traced out. Redacted. Yes, everything was redacted in the first round. It was really a joke. It was like taunting. And then we sued again, and then only the names of the immigration people, like the officers and so forth. And thankfully, they're extraordinary note takers. So there was things like at 7 p.m. they gave my uncle some chips that like everything they did, they noted down. So when we finally got both that with the medical records too, once we got those, I was able to also recreate a timeline for my uncle's death, like every step of the way. Once we got all the documents, I was able to do that. So I also wanted the book to be that way. And that search, because when you lose someone like that, and everybody, people who've lost loved ones suddenly, and I look at the face of the kids that these demonstrations, I look at their faces and I can see it. It's like when you lose somebody suddenly, you want answers that you will never get, right? What were they thinking? Were they in pain? Were they, and I was so close to where my uncle was. And I could have seen him if they'd let me, and I felt like I could have been there even if he was going to die anyway. So all of these questions, and then I had these documents, so that also was healing and trying to recreate his last moments for me. I think I have also a very practical mind, but also this imagination where things that always goes to the worst places, right? That maybe he was tortured, maybe he was and so. I'm not sure I believe all the documents, things that I had, but that's all I had to work with, and I was able to recreate of at least one version of what his last hours were, and that was very therapeutic. You get to pick.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is like on another topic. So as you keep on sharing your stories on your personal as well as stories from people around you, have you ever wondered how your stories will empower more people of color to write? And also, as a fellow Caribbean writer, do you feel as your contemporaries have been properly represented in the publishing world?
Yes, I certainly hope, one of the things, definitely, I hope that people, when I was done with this book and with other things that I've written that are in that similar kind of vein, I always hope that it inspires other people to tell their stories. And it has, and you know, I've met a lot of people who it has inspired. And not everybody's going to be able to tell their stories in the same way. Not everybody's going to write a book, but even if they share a part of their story with their children, there are a lot of, you know, as we've heard in these DACA cases, there are a lot of children who only find out that their parents' immigration status when they need some kind of paper that they can't get from them, right? And so, so like that, like opening these conversations and about mixed status families, about how we got here, about why we got here. I think it doesn't always have to be in a book, but it could be in other ways that, you know, so I definitely hope. And in terms of people of color, women in color in publishing, I mean, I think it's gotten a little better over the years. I mean, it's certainly not, it could be so much more, but it's, you know, when I was starting, there were, like, in terms of if you were teaching a class on, you know, and Professor Lato too is back there, and she's traveled, you know, she's a professor emerita here at Brooklyn College and was one of the first people to, you know, to bring me here, and you know, we would meet at conferences. You know, there are probably a lot more for you to teach now if you were still teaching than there was maybe 25 years ago, right? But we still could do definitely a lot better.
This is more of it's a comment as opposed to a question, but I grew up in the 80s and 90s where it wasn't cool to be Haitian, so we didn't have much literature to explain immigration or explain to Haitian children about Haiti. So I just want to thank you for Mama's Nightingale, because I have children of my own and they love the story, and it teaches, I have hope for this new generation, because literatures like Mama's Nightingale teaches empathy. So when my children see, you know, hear stories about the work I do because I'm an immigration counselor, and they see things on television, or they hear stories about my parents and myself because I'm an immigrant myself, and they understand, not because of mommy, but they see like the DACA stories and children through, I'm sorry, I get, you know, emotional when I talk about stories about immigration, but overall, I just want to say thank you for your literature, and thank you for prepping the new generation to show empathy towards others. So.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And Mama's Nightingale, for those of you who may not know, it's a picture book about, and it's kind of was inspired by my mother when people talk about the immigration raids now in the 80s. I'm also, you know, I came here when I was 12. Brooklyn in the 80s was my beginning here, and there were, you know, this era feels familiar in the sense that they had the immigration raids in the 80s, you know, the Reagan era. They would take people out of factories, you know, that stuff was happening back then too. And my mom got caught up in one of those raids when she was pregnant with one of my brothers and was detained for about 3 days while pregnant. And so the book is about a child whose mom is in immigration custody, and there are about 70,000 kids like that, again, in mixed status families who are U.S. citizen children with parents who are either undocumented or, you know, or awaiting documentation. And so this is a little girl like that who's really determined to try to get her mom out of detention. That's the story of Mama's Nightingale. Mm-hmm.
I think of it as journalism, a lot of it, as well as a memoir, because all this hard work you did to dredge up these documents and getting rid of the redactions and everything. And you write in so many genres, including children's literature. Do you consciously decide this is going to go in this direction, or is it just, you know, you have something you want to write about and it goes in what memoir to fiction, to children's literature, to journalism, to essays in the New Yorker. I mean, what happens inside of you when you're writing something? Because you love writing. So.
I do love writing. Yeah, sometimes I think it's saving my life. Usually the way that the material will present itself in the genre that it is. So often with the like the more opinion type pieces that are like the ones on the New Yorker website, often there's like an urgency to that. Like usually I'll be like, it'll be a week of just like, okay, I gotta write this because I'm not going to sleep if I don't do it. And then we're just going back and forth on it for that week. So there's usually an urgency to those pieces that you have to say, like you have to work in the immediate moment to say them. And then the fiction takes longer because you have to process it to the point where you can create characters and situations and nuance and so forth. So the nonfiction is it's the more immediate work, and then the fiction is sort of the more contemplative work where after you've processed something, you have to then tell a larger story about it. But it just, and then the children's stories I really became interested in when I had my children, and I often said, one day they'll realize that I'm stealing from them. Actually, because next in December, around in the winter, they call it I have another picture book coming out called My Mommy Medicine. It's a simpler story. It's about sick days, what we do at home on sick days, and that was inspired by being at home on sick days with my daughters, and so. And that one came, definitely I knew that would be a picture book, but it just presents itself in the way that it wants to be. But it also, for me, it keeps me from getting bored, right, with the different, with one genre exactly. So when I go back to that genre, I'm just happier with it because I've missed it. Okay, so the film work, you could just tell I'm just hyper. I just like to go from thing to thing. But the film work, when after I went to graduate school, I started, my first job out of graduate school was for a film company that was run by Jonathan Demme, who did The Silence of the Lambs. And so when I started working for him, we did documentaries together, and documentaries about Haiti, one called The Agronomist, and then a smaller one called Courage and Pain that I write about and create dangerously. That one hasn't been much distributed, but it was an extraordinary experience making it because it was people who were just leaving Haiti in the 90s, after a coup d'etat, and were here telling their stories. One of them was a woman named Alette Bilance, who was going around telling what had happened to her. She was brutalized one evening by some, paramilitary people. So working on those films always felt to me like an extension of what I was doing on the page. But working in film also makes me feel very lucky for the way for what I do. Because one example was when I was working for Jonathan Demme, he filmed Beloved, Toni Morrison's Beloved. And I remember the day Toni Morrison came to the set, it was the day that they were filming this carnival, where Sethi and Paul D and Denver, they were going to the carnival. And it was a huge scene. And I remember Ms. Morrison walking through the set, and it was like, man, this was a day of work for me. but it took she sat down and wrote that, but it literally took 300 people to actually stage it for film. So that made me feel like writers are lucky. We don't have to get actors. We don't have to get, So that's also made me feel like that this is more my line of work. But I do enjoy also watching a different version of something emerge in film.
And you develop characters, do you already know who they are before you begin writing, or do you let them develop as you go from previous experiences but putting more of a fictional twist on it?
It all depends. Like, for example, the stories in Creek Crack, my story collection, a lot of them just came out whole. They're shorter, and I wrote a lot of them when I was in college, and usually the night before a big final exam, I would suddenly get like inspiration. A lot of them came out like they were tools of procrastination. And so some of them came out just like that, just like a poem might, and but others, like in Claire of the Sea Light, which is my most recent work of fiction, and that one I had watched a documentary about people who gave their children to orphanages, but were not necessarily, they were alive, but they couldn't take care of their children. They would bring them, and then there was someone in the documentary who said, oh, those people, they don't love their kids as much as we love our kids. And then I was so mad. And then this character, this little girl, came out of that anger. So sometimes it all depends. And I often, say to that is that character creation in stories, it's like meeting people. There are people you meet for the first time in your life whose face you've never seen before, and you feel like they've been in your life forever. And some characters come like that. And there are people that you have to draw out, that it's a longer revelation, right? You get to know them more day by day. And so there are characters who appear like the first kind, where they just appear to you fully formed, and you just have to write what you see. And then there are other characters that you have to, there are writers who fill out questionnaires, who do resumes, so there are some that it all depends on the story.
I'm wondering if we should wrap up so that you have time to sign books.
Mm-hmm.
Students, we're approaching the point in the semester where they will be writing their own short testimonio.
Ooh.
So I wonder if you have any last, words of advice for them. Maybe the night before a final, they'll get inspired and just write it, or
Well, I would tell them, especially in personal narrative, be brave, right? Because sometimes that is the biggest hindrance of what I should share, what I shouldn't share, what will people think about me, how will they react, what am I exposing, to be brave, just take a chance and being vulnerable, because I think that's where the best, especially personal kind of writing, comes from, to not be afraid of vulnerability. And just, even if, just feel like you're writing it for yourself, but just write it as though nobody was going to read it, and to not be afraid to be as vulnerable, because that place where it hurts, that place where you're just like, where you're crying, that place where you're like, oh my God, I don't want anybody to know that, that's where probably the best stuff will come from.
Great.
Yeah.